not going to believe what happened to me last winter. I'm still not sure I believe it myself, but I've got to tell someone. My hands still shake when I think about it. I'm 72 years old, and I've been living alone in these mountains for almost 15 years now. My cabin sits about 12 miles up an old logging road that most folks don't even know exists anymore. The county stopped maintaining it years ago, so it's just me and whoever's brave enough to drive a 4-wheel drive up here. That's usually just the mail carrier once a week, and maybe a hunter or two during season. I moved up here after my husband passed. The city got too loud, too full of memories. Up here, the only sounds are wind through the pines, creek water running over rocks, and the occasional deer stepping through my yard. It suits me fine. I've got my vegetable garden, a few chickens, and enough firewood to last through any winter. Or so I thought. October had been unusually warm that year. I remember thinking it was strange because usually by the middle of the month, I'd already had my first frost. But the leaves were still green on some trees, and I was still harvesting tomatoes from my garden well into November. The chickens were laying more eggs than usual, and even they seemed confused by the extended summer weather. The old-timers in town had been predicting a hard winter. They always do, but this time they seemed more serious about it. Every trip down the mountain for supplies, I'd hear the same warnings. Stock up early, get your firewood cut, make sure your roof can handle heavy snow. The kind of talk that makes you pay attention even when you've heard it all before. I'd been through plenty of mountain winters, but something about the way the weather was acting made me nervous. Animals were behaving strangely too. The squirrels were working overtime, burying nuts everywhere. Birds that should have migrated south weeks earlier were still hanging around, like they couldn't decide what to do. Even my chickens were acting different, staying closer to the coop and making more noise than usual. By late November, I'd cut and stacked more firewood than I'd ever stored before. My little root cellar was packed with preserved vegetables, canned goods, and emergency supplies. I'd even bought extra feed for the chickens and made sure my backup generator was in working order. Looking back, it's like some instinct was telling me to prepare for something bigger than a normal winter storm. The temperature drop came suddenly. On a Tuesday, it was still warm enough to work outside in a light jacket. By Wednesday morning, there was ice on the water bucket, and the weather radio was already talking about an unusual storm system forming in the west. The kind of storm they give names to and track like hurricanes. December hit us hard last year. By the third week, we'd already had more snow than most winters see total. The Weather Service kept talking about a massive storm system moving in from the west, something they were calling a once-in-a-decade event. I'd lived through plenty of bad weather, so I just did what I always do, checked my supplies, stacked extra wood by the door, and made sure the chicken coop was secure. But this felt different from the start. The air pressure was dropping so fast it made my ears pop. The wind patterns were wrong too, coming from directions that usually meant tornado weather, not snow. The chickens stopped laying completely and huddled together in their coop, even during the day. My old bones were aching in ways they never had before. The first flakes started falling on Monday evening, tiny and hard like bits of ice. By Tuesday morning, we had 6 inches of the driest snow I'd ever seen. It didn't pack at all, just blew around like sand. The wind was constant, but not terrible yet, just steady enough to keep the snow moving and make it hard to see very far. I spent Tuesday checking on everything twice. The chickens had plenty of food and water, though they seemed agitated. The wood pile was covered and easily accessible. All my windows were secured, and I'd brought extra kerosene inside for the lamps. The generator was tested and ready, though I was hoping not to need it. Tuesday night, the real storm began. The storm hit on a Tuesday night. I remember because I'd been listening to the radio earlier, and they were still talking about it like it might change course. But around 8 o'clock, the wind started picking up, and by 9, I could barely see the chicken coop from my kitchen window. The transformation was incredible to watch. What had been steady but manageable wind suddenly turned into something alive and furious. The house started creaking in ways I'd never heard before, and snow began hitting the windows so hard it sounded like someone throwing handfuls of gravel at the glass. By 10 o'clock, I couldn't see my own porch light from inside the house. The snow wasn't just falling anymore. It was moving horizontally, driven by winds that had to be gusting over 60 miles an hour. Trees that had stood for decades were bending like grass, and I could hear them snapping in the distance, sharp cracks that cut through the howling wind. The temperature was dropping fast too. My thermometer went from 20 degrees at sunset to below zero by midnight, and it kept falling. Even with the fire going full blast and every lamp lit, the house was getting cold. I could feel the heat being sucked right out through the walls, no matter how much wood I fed the fire. By midnight, I knew this was different. The wind wasn't just howling, it was screaming. Snow was coming down so thick it looked like a white wall had been built right outside my windows. The temperature dropped so fast I could actually feel the cold creeping through the walls, even with the fire going strong. The power went out around 2 in the morning, not unusual for up here, but the timing wasn't great. I had plenty of candles and oil lamps, but the house started getting cold fast without the electric heater helping out. I threw another log on the fire and tried to get some sleep, but the noise was incredible. Trees were cracking like gunshots, and something kept banging against the side of the house. Sleep was impossible. Every few minutes, something would crash in the forest, another tree going down probably, and the sound would echo through the mountains like thunder. The wind was so loud it was hard to think, and the house was shaking with each gust. Around 3 in the morning, I heard something different, a rhythmic thumping against the back wall of the house, too regular to be just debris in the wind. I grabbed a flashlight and checked every window I could safely reach, but the snow was so thick I couldn't see anything. The thumping continued for about 20 minutes, then stopped as suddenly as it had started. By dawn, the storm was still raging but had settled into a pattern. The wind would howl for 10 or 15 minutes, then calm down to almost nothing, then pick up again even stronger than before. During the calm periods, I could hear the settling and cracking of snow and ice, the sound of a landscape being completely transformed. I managed to get the door open during one of the calmer moments and looked out at a world I didn't recognize. The snow was already 3 feet deep and still falling hard. My truck was completely buried, just a white mound where I knew it was parked. The path to the chicken coop had vanished entirely, and the coop itself was half buried in a drift. The chickens were still alive. I could hear them clucking anxiously in their shelter, but there was no way I could get to them safely. I'd have to wait for the storm to pass and then dig them out. At least the coop was sturdy and well insulated. They'd be cold and scared, but they'd survive. Wednesday was worse than Tuesday night. The storm had intensified overnight, and now the snow was coming down so fast I couldn't see my own hand when I held it out in front of my face. The wind was constant, no more calm periods, just endless howling that made the house shake. I spent the day feeding the fire and checking for leaks or damage. The roof was holding, but I could hear ice building up in the gutters. A few of the windows were developing frost on the inside despite the fire. The cold was winning, slowly but steadily. Around noon, the banging started again. This time it was on the front of the house, near the door. Rhythmic thumping, like something was trying to get in. I peered through the window but couldn't see anything except swirling snow. The sound continued for hours, sometimes stopping for a while, then starting up again from a different location. I started to wonder if it was an animal, maybe a deer or elk seeking shelter from the storm. But the sound was too purposeful, too regular. It was like something was testing the house, checking for weak points or ways inside. By evening, I was starting to worry about my supplies. I'd used more firewood than expected because of the extreme cold. and I was burning through my lamp oil faster than usual too. If the storm lasted much longer, I might have to start rationing heat. The banging stopped around sunset, but by then I was too on edge to relax. Every sound the house made had me jumping. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps on the roof. I kept checking the locks on the doors, even though I knew nothing human could be out there in this weather. Wednesday night was a test of endurance. The storm had been going for over 24 hours, and there was no sign of it slowing down. If anything, it seemed to be getting worse. The wind was so loud I couldn't hear myself think, and the cold was seeping through every crack and crevice in the walls. I pulled my mattress into the main room close to the fireplace and tried to sleep there. It was warmer than the bedroom, but still cold enough that I needed every blanket I owned. The fire had to be fed every hour, which meant I never got more than 40 or 50 minutes of sleep at a time. Around 10 o'clock, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was crying. Not the wind, not tree branches rubbing together, but actual crying. Like a baby, but deeper somehow, more resonant. At first I thought the storm was playing tricks on my ears, but the sound continued even during the brief moments when the wind died down. The crying seemed to be coming from outside, somewhere near the house. It was faint but persistent, rising and falling like a baby's wail, but with an undertone that was definitely not human. My first thought was that it might be a wildcat or some other animal, but I'd never heard anything quite like it. I tried to ignore it and get some sleep, but the sound kept pulling at me. There was something about it that was deeply distressing, a quality that seemed to reach right into my chest and squeeze my heart. It wasn't just the cry of an animal in distress, it was the sound of something young and helpless and terrified. The second night was worse. The storm just wouldn't quit. I'd been through the routine, check the fire, check the windows for ice buildup, make sure nothing was leaking. I was getting ready for bed when I heard something that stopped me cold. The crying was clearer now, definitely coming from right outside the house. During a brief lull in the wind, I could hear it plainly. Two distinct voices, both young, both in distress. The sounds they were making weren't quite like anything I'd heard before, but the emotion behind them was unmistakable. Whatever was out there was cold, scared, and probably dying. I grabbed my flashlight and heavy coat. Common sense told me to stay inside, but something about that sound pulled at me. It was the kind of crying that meant something was hurt and scared. I'd raised 3 children and helped with countless grandchildren over the years, and that instinct to respond to a baby's cry was too strong to ignore. The cold hit me like a physical blow when I opened the door. The wind tried to tear the flashlight right out of my hands, and the snow was so thick I could barely breathe. But the crying was clearer now, coming from the side of the house where the foundation meets the ground. I followed the sound, stepping carefully because the snow was already up past my knees in most places and over my waist where it had drifted. The wind kept trying to push me off balance, and several times I had to grab onto the side of the house to keep from falling. When I got around to the side of the cabin, my flashlight beam caught something dark huddled against the stone foundation. At first, I thought it was a pile of old branches or maybe some trash that had blown in during the storm. Then it moved, and I realized I was looking at something alive. There were 2 of them pressed together against the coal stone. They were small, maybe the size of 3-year-old children, but their proportions were all wrong. Their arms and legs were too long, their torsos too broad. They were covered in dark brown fur that was matted and stiff with ice crystals. But it was their faces that stopped me cold. They weren't quite human, and they weren't quite animal, something in between. The bone structure was more human than ape, but the proportions were different. Larger eye sockets, a more pronounced brow ridge, a flatter nose. Their eyes were enormous and dark. and when they looked up at me, I saw intelligence there. Not animal intelligence, something much deeper and more complex. They were dying. I could see that right away. Their breathing was shallow and labored, their bodies shaking so violently they could barely stay upright. Ice had formed on their fur, their eyelashes, even around their nostrils. Whatever they were just babies, and they were freezing to death against my house. I didn't think about what they might be or whether they could be dangerous. All I saw were two small creatures that desperately needed help. The maternal instinct that had driven me outside was stronger than any fear or confusion about what I was looking at. I pulled off my heavy coat and wrapped it around both of them as best I could. They didn't resist or try to run away. If anything, they seemed to understand that I was trying to help. They made soft whimpering sounds and pressed closer to my warmth. Their small hands, and they were definitely hands with opposable thumbs and individual fingers clutching at my clothes. They were heavier than I expected, dense and solid, like children who'd been well fed, but I managed to lift them both. One was noticeably smaller than the other, maybe a year or so younger, and it seemed weaker. The larger one kept making soft sounds to its companion, as if trying to reassure it. Getting them inside was a struggle. The wind kept trying to push me off balance, and I couldn't see much with both hands full and my flashlight tucked under my arm. Snow was blowing directly into my face, and more than once I had to stop and feel my way along the wall of the house to make sure I was going in the right direction. When I finally got the door open and stumbled into the relative warmth of the cabin, the difference was overwhelming. The creatures in my arms seemed to feel it immediately. Their shivering intensified at first, as if their bodies were shocked by the change in temperature, then gradually began to ease. I set them down in front of the fireplace and wrapped them in every blanket I could find. Their fur was so cold it felt like touching ice, and they were shivering so violently I was afraid they might be having some kind of seizure. I could see ice crystals everywhere, on their fur, their eyelashes, around their nostrils and mouths. I built up the fire as much as I dared and moved them as close to it as possible without risking burns. They seemed to understand what fire was and didn't try to touch it, but they pressed as close as they could get and held their hands out toward the warmth. Their hands were fascinating and disturbing at the same time. They were definitely not human, but they weren't animal paws either. The fingers were longer than human fingers, with an extra joint that allowed them to bend in ways mine couldn't. The thumbs were positioned differently too, giving them a grip that looked incredibly strong and versatile. I warmed some milk on the wood stove, testing it carefully to make sure it wasn't too hot. When I offered it to them, they looked at the cup with obvious intelligence, understanding what I was offering, but uncertain whether to trust me. The larger of the two creatures reached out tentatively and touched the cup, then pulled its hand back as if testing the temperature. Finding it acceptable, it took the cup in both hands and drank slowly, watching me over the rim with those enormous dark eyes. The smaller one was more hesitant. It looked back and forth between me and its companion, clearly wanting the warmth and nourishment but afraid to take it. The larger one made soft sounds to it, a kind of gentle crooning that seemed to be encouragement. Finally, the smaller one accepted its own cup and drank. I gave them small pieces of bread and some leftover soup that I warmed on the stove. They ate carefully, examining each piece of food before putting it in their mouths. Their table manners were surprisingly good. They didn't grab or snatch, and they seemed to understand the concept of sharing. What struck me most was how they communicated with each other. They made soft sounds, not quite languid, but definitely meaningful. The larger one seemed to be taking care of the smaller one, offering it food first, making sure it stayed close to the fire, touching it gently when it seemed frightened. They never took their eyes off me while they ate, not in an aggressive or threatening way, but with intense curiosity. They were studying me just as carefully as I was studying them, trying to figure out what I was and whether I meant them harm. When they had eaten enough to take the edge off their hunger, they huddled together near the fire and seemed to relax for the first time since I'd brought them inside. Their shivering had stopped and their breathing was deeper and more regular. The smaller one actually fell asleep, curled against its companion's side. I didn't sleep at all that first night. I kept the fire going and watched them breathe, making sure they were getting warmer and stronger. Part of me was terrified. I mean, what were these things? Where had they come from? But mostly I just felt protective. They were so small and vulnerable, and they'd been so close to death when I found them. Around dawn, their condition had improved dramatically. They were no longer shivering, and their fur had dried out and fluffed up, making them look larger and healthier. They seemed stronger too, more alert and curious about their surroundings. The larger one got up and began exploring the cabin, moving carefully and touching things gently. It seemed particularly interested in my books, running its fingers over the covers and opening them to look at the pages. It couldn't read, obviously, but it seemed to understand that the marks on the paper meant something. The smaller one stayed close to the fire but watched everything its companion did with interest. When the larger one found a small hand mirror on my dresser, both of them were fascinated by their reflections. They touched the glass gently, then looked behind the mirror to see where the images were coming from. Their intelligence was undeniable. They weren't just smart animals, they were thinking, reasoning beings with curiosity and problem-solving abilities. When they encountered something they didn't understand, they didn't just react instinctively, they studied it, experimented with it, tried to figure out how it worked. Around mid-morning, they started making different sounds, softer, more musical tones that seemed to be directed at me. It took me a while to realize they were trying to communicate gratitude. The larger one kept pointing to itself, then to its companion, then to me, making gentle sounds each time. I started talking to them, keeping my voice soft and calm. They seemed to like the sound of human speech, even though they couldn't understand the words. They'd tilt their heads and listen intently, sometimes making soft responses that sounded almost like they were trying to join the conversation. The blizzard kept going for 2 more days. The wind never stopped completely, and the snow continued falling at a rate I'd never seen before. By Thursday morning, I couldn't even see the chicken coop anymore. It was completely buried under a drift that had to be 8 or 9 feet deep. The creatures, I'd started thinking of them as children somehow, settled into a routine with surprising ease. They helped me tend the fire, bringing me small pieces of wood from the pile by the door. They seemed to understand that the fire was essential for warmth and life, and they were careful never to let it burn too low. They watched everything I did with intense concentration, as if they were trying to learn how human things worked. When I cooked, they stood nearby and observed every step of the process. When I read, they sat quietly and listened to the sound of my voice, sometimes making soft sounds that seemed like questions or comments. The smaller one was shyer than its companion, but it was also more affectionate. It would sit close to me while I worked on small tasks, sometimes reaching out to touch my hand or arm gently. The larger one was more independent and curious, always exploring something new or trying to figure out how things worked. They learned incredibly quickly. By the second day, they understood basic cause and effect relationships around the cabin. They knew that wood made fire burn brighter, that fire made warmth, that warmth was good. They knew that certain sounds I made meant I was pleased with them, and others meant I wanted them to be careful. Most amazingly, they seemed to understand the concept of helping. Without being asked or trained, they started anticipating what I needed and trying to provide it. If I was struggling to reach something, one of them would get it for me. If I was working on a task that required multiple hands, they'd step in to assist. Their concern for each other was touching to watch. The larger one constantly checked on its smaller companion, making sure it was warm enough, fed enough, safe enough. The smaller one looked to its companion for guidance and reassurance, but also showed remarkable independence for something so young. By Thursday evening, it felt natural having them there. They'd found their places in the cabin's daily routine, and their presence was comforting rather than frightening. When I sat by the fire to read in the evening, they'd settle down nearby, the smaller one often falling asleep against my leg while the larger one listened to my voice. Friday morning, I woke up to an unusual silence. The storm hadn't stopped completely, but the wind had died down enough that I could hear individual sounds again. The settling of snow, the creaking of tree branches, the distant call of a bird that had somehow survived the blizzard. The creatures seemed to sense the change immediately. They went to the windows and looked out at the snow-covered landscape, then back at me, then at the door. For the first time since I'd brought them inside, they seemed restless, even agitated. I bundled up and went outside to assess the damage and check on the chickens. The world had been completely transformed. Snow was piled higher than my head in some places, and the familiar landmarks of my property were buried or unrecognizable. Several large trees had come down, and my usual paths were impassable. The creatures followed me to the door, but wouldn't step outside. They stood in the doorway, sniffing the air and making soft sounds to each other that seemed different from their usual communication. There was an urgency to their behavior that made me nervous, though I couldn't pinpoint why. The chickens had survived, though they were cold and traumatized. Their water had frozen solid, and they'd eaten most of their emergency food supply. I spent an hour digging them out and making sure they had fresh food and water, all while the two creatures watched from the doorway with obvious concern. That's when I saw the tracks. They were enormous, at least 18 inches long and 8 inches wide at their widest point. They looked almost human, but with much longer toes, and what appeared to be claw marks at the tips. The stride length was incredible too, suggesting something much taller and more powerful than any human. The tracks came from deep in the forest, wound around my house several times, then headed back into the woods in a different direction. They were fresh, made sometime after the snow had stopped falling, but before I'd come outside. Something large had been checking out my property while I slept. I followed the tracks with my eyes as far as I could see into the forest. They moved in a purposeful pattern, not wandering or meandering like an animal's tracks might. Whoever or whatever had made them knew exactly where they were going and what they were looking for. The tracks went right up to my walls, under my windows, around to the exact spot where I'd found the two small creatures. Then they circled the house twice before heading back into the deep woods in a straight line. My heart started beating faster as the implications sank in. These tracks belonged to the family of the creatures I'd rescued. Parents, siblings, maybe an entire group had come looking for the missing babies. They'd found the house where their children were being sheltered, confirmed they were safe, and then retreated to wait. I looked back at the two small faces watching me from the doorway. They were making new sounds now, not quite whimpering, but not quite calling either. Their whole bodies were tense with anticipation, and they kept looking toward the woods where the tracks disappeared. The larger one came outside for the first time, stepping carefully in the deep snow, but moving with obvious purpose toward the edge of the forest. It stopped about 20 feet from the house and made a series of calls, louder than any sounds I'd heard from either of them before, carrying clearly through the still air. From somewhere deep in the woods came an answering call, low and resonant, unmistakably similar to what the young one had made, but much deeper and more powerful. The sound seemed to come from multiple directions at once, as if there were several large creatures spread out through the forest. The smaller creature joined its companion outside, and both of them began making excited sounds toward the woods. They were talking to their family, I realized, letting them know they were alive and well, probably explaining what had happened to them. The sounds from the forest grew closer and more numerous. What had started as distant calls became a complex conversation involving multiple voices of different pitches and tones. Some were definitely adult voices, deep and powerful. Others sounded younger, possibly adolescents or other children. I could hear movement in the woods now, the sound of large bodies pushing through snow and undergrowth. Branches were breaking and snow was falling from disturbed pine boughs. Whatever was out there, there were a lot of them, and they were big. The two young creatures became more and more excited as their family approached. They were practically dancing in the snow, making joyful sounds and gesturing toward the house, toward me, toward the woods. They seemed to be explaining their adventure, describing how they'd been rescued and cared for. Then I saw the first adult. It stepped out from behind a massive pine tree about 50 yards away. Even at that distance, its size was overwhelming. It had to be 8 feet tall at least, with shoulders broader than any human I'd ever seen. Its body was covered in the same dark brown fur as the young ones, but there was nothing childlike about its build or bearing. It looked directly at me and went perfectly still, studying me with obvious intelligence. I felt like I was being evaluated, assessed for threat level and intent. The two young creatures ran toward it, calling out in excited voices, but the adult held up one enormous hand and they stopped immediately. More adults appeared between the trees. I lost count after a dozen, but there were definitely more than that. They moved silently despite their size, positioning themselves in a loose circle around my property. It was clearly a coordinated effort, the kind of tactical thinking that required communication and planning. The largest one, obviously the leader of the group, stepped forward. It was even bigger than the others, maybe 9 feet tall, with scars across its chest and arms that spoke of a long and dangerous life. Its eyes were the same dark color as the young ones, but there was nothing gentle about its expression. The leader approached slowly and deliberately, each step clearly calculated. It never took its eyes off me, and I could see it was ready to react instantly if I made any threatening moves. The other adults maintained their positions in the circle, effectively surrounding me, though they kept their distance. When the leader was about 20 feet away, it stopped and made a sound I'll never forget. A deep, rumbling vocalization that seemed to come from its chest rather than its throat. It wasn't quite a growl, but it was definitely a sound of authority and power. The two young creatures responded immediately, moving to a position halfway between me and their leader. They began making rapid, excited sounds, gesturing toward me, toward the house, toward themselves. They were telling their story, I realized, explaining how they'd been caught in the storm, how I'd found them and brought them inside, how I'd fed them and kept them warm. The leader listened without interrupting, its gaze never leaving my face. I could see it processing the information, trying to understand the relationship between its children and this strange human who had sheltered them. Other adults moved closer during this explanation, close enough that I could see the intelligence in their eyes. The family resemblances between them and the young ones. Some were clearly females with slightly smaller builds and more delicate features. Others were obviously males, larger and more heavily muscled. What struck me most was how human-like their behavior was, despite their non-human appearance. They stood upright naturally, used their hands expressively while communicating, and showed clear emotional responses to what the young ones were telling them. This wasn't just a group of animals, it was a family with all the complex relationships and dynamics that implied. The leader continued to study me while the young ones finished their story. When they were done, It looked back and forth between them and me several times, processing the information and coming to some kind of decision. Then something remarkable happened. One of the young creatures, the larger one that had been braver throughout their stay, ran back to me and took my hand. It led me forward a few steps, then gestured toward its family leader while making soft musical sounds. I understood what it was doing. It was introducing me, vouching for me, making it clear that I was a friend rather than a threat. The smaller one joined us, taking my other hand and adding its own voice to the introduction. The leader's expression began to change. The wariness didn't disappear completely, but it was joined by something that might have been gratitude or respect. It looked at its children, both obviously healthy and unharmed despite their ordeal, then back at me. Slowly, deliberately, the massive creature lowered its head toward me. It wasn't quite a bow, but it was definitely a gesture of acknowledgement and respect, understanding that I had helped its children when they needed it most. One by one, every other adult in the group did the same thing. A dozen enormous heads lowering in my direction, a moment of recognition that transcended species boundaries. It was the most profound nonverbal communication I'd ever experienced. After the moment of acknowledgement, the leader gently but firmly called its children to come forward. They looked back at me with obvious reluctance, making sounds that seemed like attempts to explain or apologize for having to leave. I knelt down in the snow and let them approach me one last time. The smaller one pressed against me briefly, making a soft sound that could only be described as affectionate. The larger one touched my face gently with one hand, then made a complex series of sounds that felt like a thank you in any language. I tried to speak to them to let them know that caring for them had been my privilege, not my burden. I don't think they understood my words, but they seemed to understand my tone and intent. Both of them touched my hands one final time before stepping back toward their family. The leader made a low sound, and immediately the entire group began moving toward the forest. The young ones stayed close to their parents, but they kept looking back at me until the trees blocked them from view. Within minutes, they had vanished completely. The forest swallowed them up as if they had never been there at all. If not for the tracks in the snow and the memories burned into my mind, I might have convinced myself the whole thing had been a dream. The silence after they left was deafening. For 4 days, my cabin had been full of soft sounds, gentle movement, the presence of beings who were learning and growing and communicating. Now it was just me again, and the quiet felt oppressive. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, going through the motions of normal activities, but unable to stop thinking about what I'd experienced. The cabin felt huge and empty without my small visitors. I kept expecting to hear their soft calls or see them bringing me pieces of wood for the fire. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying every moment of the encounter, from finding them nearly frozen to death to watching them disappear into the forest with their family. Had it really happened? The rational part of my mind insisted it must have been some kind of hallucination brought on by isolation and storm stress. But the evidence was undeniable. The blankets they'd used still smelled different, carrying a wild, outdoorsy scent that wasn't quite like any animal I knew. The cups they'd drunk from were exactly where I'd left them after washing up. And most convincingly, their tracks were still visible in the snow around the house, alongside the enormous prints of their family members. I realized that I'd been changed by the experience in ways I was only beginning to understand. For 4 days, I'd been responsible for 2 beings who were entirely dependent on me for survival. I'd felt protective, maternal, connected to something larger than myself in a way I hadn't experienced since my own children were young. Over the next few days, I found myself looking for signs of my former guests. Sometimes I thought I caught glimpses of movement in the distant trees, but I was never sure if it was them or just shadows and wishful thinking. Small things around the property began to change in ways that made me wonder. My woodpile, which had been somewhat haphazardly stacked, appeared more organized when I went out to get fuel for the fire. Fallen branches that had been blocking paths were moved aside, though I hadn't touched them. Most significantly, I started finding small offerings at the edge of my property. Smooth stones arranged in patterns, bundles of dried berries, pieces of bark with interesting natural designs. They appeared overnight and were always placed where I'd be sure to notice them during my daily routines. I began leaving offerings of my own, pieces of bread, fruit from my pantry, sometimes small tools or bright objects that I thought might interest them. They were always gone by morning, though that could have been any number of forest animals. The sense of being watched wasn't frightening, it felt protective. I had the distinct impression that my property was being guarded, that something was looking out for me the way I had looked out for the 2 young ones during the storm. As winter progressed into spring, my understanding of what had happened continued to evolve. I'd encountered a family of beings that most people would consider mythological, but they were as real as the trees and mountains around me. They had intelligence, emotions, family bonds, and social structures that paralleled human society in many ways. More than that, they had demonstrated something that transcended species boundaries, the ability to recognize kindness and respond with gratitude. The brief time I'd spent caring for their young ones had created a bond that continued long after they had returned to their forest home. Spring brought new evidence of their continued presence. Wildflowers appeared in my garden in patterns too deliberate to be natural. My vegetable seedlings were protected from late frosts by carefully placed pine boughs that I hadn't put there. The chicken coop, which had suffered some storm damage, was mysteriously repaired one night with materials and techniques I didn't recognize. I began to understand that I was no longer just a solitary human living in the mountains. I was part of a larger community, one that included neighbors I would never see in daylight, but who were watching over me nonetheless. The thought should have been unsettling, but instead it was deeply comforting. Summer brought more subtle signs of my unseen neighbors. Paths through the forest that I used regularly were kept clear of fallen branches and debris. Dangerous areas where erosion had made footing treacherous were marked with carefully placed stones or sticks. It was as if someone was maintaining the mountain specifically for my safety and convenience. The offerings continued too, evolving with the seasons. Summer brought arrangements of berries and edible plants, always varieties I recognized as safe and nutritious. Fall brought nuts and seeds, carefully sorted and cleaned. The presentation was always thoughtful, arranged in ways that showed care and consideration. I started spending more time outdoors, partly hoping for another glimpse of my mysterious neighbors, but mostly because the forest felt safer and more welcoming than it ever had before. I would sit on my porch in the evenings and sometimes hear distant sounds, not quite voices, but not random forest noise either. Conversations, perhaps, or maybe songs. The chickens had become braver too, venturing farther from their coop than they ever had before. It was as if they sensed the protective presence in the forest and knew they were safe from predators. Indeed, I never lost a single bird to foxes or hawks that summer, despite them ranging freely through areas where losses had been common before. When December came round again, I found myself thinking constantly about the anniversary of my encounter. A full year had passed since that incredible blizzard, since I'd found 2 small creatures dying in the snow and changed both their lives and mine forever. The winter was milder that year, with regular snowfalls, but nothing approaching the ferocity of the previous year's storm. I was almost disappointed. Part of me had been hoping for another opportunity to help. Another chance to demonstrate that humans could be trusted. On the exact anniversary of the night I'd found them, I heard familiar sounds outside my cabin. Not crying this time, but soft calls that I recognized immediately. I looked out the window and saw tracks in the fresh snow, not the enormous adult prints I'd seen before, but smaller ones. Young adult size, perhaps, or late adolescent. I put on my coat and went outside, following the tracks to the edge of my property. There, barely visible in the moonlight, were two figures standing at the tree line. They were much larger than they'd been as babies, but still smaller than the adults I'd seen that day in the snow. The same two children, now nearly grown. They didn't approach the house, but they stood there for several minutes, occasionally making soft sounds in my direction. I had the distinct impression they were saying hello, checking on me, letting me know they were well and hadn't forgotten what I'd done for them. I called out softly, thanking them for coming, telling them how good it was to see them again. They seemed to understand my tone even if they couldn't comprehend my words. One of them, I thought it might be the smaller one from the year before, raised what might have been a hand in something that looked very much like a wave. Then they melted back into the forest, leaving only their tracks and my overwhelming sense of gratitude for this brief reunion. That visit established a pattern that continued for years. Every winter, usually around the anniversary of our first meeting, I would receive some sign that they remembered. Sometimes it was tracks in the snow, sometimes distant calls, once a small pile of pine cones arranged on my porch in a pattern that spelled out what could have been a crude attempt at letters. The protective presence never left either. I lived through several more harsh winters and difficult summers, but I never felt truly alone or endangered. Food was always supplemented by wild offerings when my own supplies ran low. Potential hazards around my property were marked or eliminated before I encountered them. My water line, which should have frozen solid during particularly cold spells, somehow never did. I began to realize that what I'd experienced wasn't just a chance encounter, it was an adoption of sorts. By saving their children, I'd become part of their extended family. The rules and obligations that govern their relationships with each other now applied to me as well. This understanding brought both comfort and responsibility. I was careful never to abuse the protection I was receiving, never to take unnecessary risks or behave in ways that might endanger my unseen guardians. I also made sure to continue offering what I could: food, simple tools, bright objects that might be useful or interesting to them. Soon, I'll have to pack up my few possessions and leave this mountain for the last time. I'll move to a small apartment in town where I can receive the medical care and daily assistance that my aging body requires. It will be comfortable and safe, but it won't be home. The life I've lived here, the relationship we've shared, has been the greatest privilege of my existence. To be trusted by beings who have every reason to fear and avoid humans, to be accepted as family by a species not my own, I can't imagine a greater honor. That's all I have to say about it. Make of it what you will, but if you're ever alone in the wilderness and you hear something calling for help, I hope you'll remember that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing the right thing even when you're terrified. For more interesting stories, check this out.